The 1960s were a turning point for Western movies. By then, the golden era of the 1950s had already saddled up and ridden across Hollywood, leaving behind classics like High Noon and Shane. But a new decade was here, and the world was changing fast. The United States was stepping into the space age, tensions were rising with the Cold War, and younger audiences weren't looking for the same clean-cut cowboy heroes anymore. They wanted grit. They wanted realism. They wanted a West that felt dangerous, unpredictable, and raw. And the Western was ready to change with the times. This was the decade when Hollywood still made grand, sweeping frontier epics, but also when filmmakers across the ocean in Italy began rewriting the rules entirely. By the end of the 1960s, the Western would be unrecognizable compared to what it had been just 10 years earlier. And in that transformation, some of the greatest films of all time were born. So let's saddle up and take a ride through the best Westerns of the 1960s. We'll meet the gunslingers, the outlaws, the legends, and the loners. Some fought for justice, some for money, and some for survival. But all of them left their mark on cinema. And it all begins in 1960 with a movie that took a Japanese classic and gave it a cowboy swagger. When audiences sat down in theaters in 1960 to watch The Magnificent Seven, they were stepping into a story they might not have known came from halfway around the world. Director John Sturges had borrowed the framework from Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, a masterpiece of Japanese cinema, and transplanted it into the dust and heat of Mexico. Instead of samurai, we had 7 American gunfighters. Instead of swords, revolvers. But the spirit was the same. A desperate village, terrorized by ruthless bandits, calls on outsiders to protect them. And what outsiders they were. Yul Brynner, with his shaved head and piercing eyes, took the lead as Chris Adams, the man who pulls the group together. Then there was Steve McQueen, a rising star whose quiet toughness and sly charm made him magnetic on screen. Charles Bronson brought grit, James Coburn brought his cool, and Robert Vaughn added a haunted edge. Even Eli Wallach, who would later play the ugly in Leone's classic, gave an unforgettable turn as Calvera, the bandit leader. The chemistry of the cast is what made the film sing. Each of the 7 had a moment to shine, a quirk, a line, or an action that made them more than just background figures. They weren't noble sheriffs or shining white-hat cowboys. They were drifters, mercenaries, men with nothing to gain and everything to lose. But when faced with injustice, they found something bigger to stand for. The score, written by Elmer Bernstein, became almost as famous as the film itself. Bold, brassy, and unforgettable, the theme of The Magnificent Seven still pops up in pop culture today. It's been used in everything from commercials to sports events because it instantly brings to mind bravery, teamwork, and larger-than-life heroism. The movie wasn't an immediate smash hit at the box office, but it grew over time, becoming one of the most beloved Westerns ever made. It spawned sequels, remakes, and even influenced a generation of ensemble action films. In many ways, The Magnificent Seven was the perfect bridge between the old Western and the new. It kept the heroic spirit alive, but it also introduced a sense of grit, of characters who weren't flawless but still found their place in history. And in 1962, John Ford, the director who practically defined the Western with films like Stagecoach and The Searchers, delivered one of the most important Westerns ever made. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance wasn't about sweeping landscapes or endless gunfights. It was about ideas, about truth, about how legends are created, and about how sometimes the myth is more powerful than the fact. The film starred 2 giants of the screen, James Stewart and John Wayne. Stewart played Ransom Stoddard, a young lawyer from the East who believes in justice, law, and the power of education. Wayne played Tom Doniphan, the tough rancher who lives by his fists and his gun. And then there was Lee Marvin, brilliant as the cruel, sneering outlaw Liberty Valance. The story is simple. but its weight is enormous. Stoddard arrives in the town of Shinbone, bringing ideals of law and order. But he quickly finds himself face to face with Valance, a man who thrives on chaos and fear. Stoddard wants to defeat him with words and principles. Doniphan knows that in the West, sometimes the only answer is a bullet. The heart of the movie is a question. Who really killed Liberty Valance? Was it the lawyer who stood up to him, or the rancher who took action in the shadows? The answer, revealed in one of cinema's most powerful flashbacks, reshapes how we think about heroes. And then comes the line that has echoed through history. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Those words cut deeper than any gunshot. They weren't just about Liberty Valance. They were about America, about how nations are built on myths, about how people prefer the comfort of a heroic story over the messy truth. John Ford was nearing the end of his career when he made this film, and it feels like a summation of everything he had explored in Westerns. He gave us John Wayne as the rugged hero for decades. Now he gave us a story about how even heroes fade into shadows, and how history belongs to the storytellers. When it first came out, some critics weren't sure what to make of it. It wasn't action-packed, it was slower, more reflective. But over time, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance has become one of the most respected Westerns ever made. It's studied, quoted, and remembered as one of the films that transformed the genre from adventure to art. While Liberty Valance was intimate and philosophical, Hollywood was also thinking bigger, much bigger. That same year, MGM released How the West Was Won, one of the grandest Westerns ever put on screen. This was no ordinary movie. It was filmed in Cinerama, a widescreen process that wrapped images across a curved screen, making audiences feel like they were inside the story. Watching it in theaters back in 1962 wasn't just seeing a movie, it was an experience. And what an experience it was. How the West Was Won told the story of America's expansion, spanning generations and covering the great movements that shaped the frontier, from river travel to the gold rush, from the Civil War to the building of the railroads. It painted a mural of the 19th century. The cast was an all-star roll call: James Stewart, Henry Fonda, John Wayne, Gregory Peck, Debbie Reynolds, George Peppard, the list goes on. Each star appeared in different segments, giving the film the feel of an epic novel with many chapters. The film didn't focus on one gunslinger or one outlaw. Instead, it was about families, pioneers, and the unstoppable push westward. It was patriotic, mythic, and larger than life. If Liberty Valance showed us the gray shadows of the West, How the West Was Won showed us the bright, sweeping legend. Critics at the time had mixed feelings. Some felt it was too big, too glossy, too much like a tourism film for American history, but audiences loved it. For many who saw it in the theater, the sheer size and scope left a memory that lasted a lifetime. Today, How the West Was Won feels like the last gasp of the classic Hollywood epic Western. It was grand, hopeful, and packed with stars. But the tide was already turning. A new kind of Western was on the horizon, one that wasn't afraid to get its hands dirty, to show violence, greed, and the ugliness that often lay just beneath the myths. Enter Sergio Leone. In 1964, he directed A Fistful of Dollars, a movie that would kick off not just his career, but an entire movement. Starring a relatively unknown TV actor named Clint Eastwood, the film introduced the world to the man with no name. Eastwood's character wasn't the clean-cut sheriff of earlier Westerns. He wasn't noble, he wasn't polished, and he certainly wasn't predictable. Dressed in a poncho, squinting from under a hat, chewing on a cigarillo, he played two rival gangs against each other in a small Mexican town. He wasn't there for honor, he was there for money. And yet, beneath the cynicism, there was a cold sense of justice. This was a new kind of Western hero. Quiet, mysterious, and dangerous. You never quite knew what he was thinking, but you knew he could outdraw anyone who dared face him. The film was shot in Spain, on dusty plains that looked harsher and more alien than the bright, clean landscapes of American westerns. Leone filled the movie with long, tense standoffs, extreme close-ups of eyes and hands, and sudden bursts of violence. And then there was the music. Ennio Morricone's score was unlike anything audiences had ever heard. Whistles, gunfire, bells, and haunting guitar strings. It was eerie, thrilling, and unforgettable. The music didn't just accompany the film, it became part of its soul. When A Fistful of Dollars was released, Hollywood brushed it off. Critics called it too violent, too rough, too strange. But audiences loved it. It was bold, stylish, and addictive. Soon it spread across the globe, making Eastwood an international star and turning Leone into a legend. And it was only the beginning. In 1965, Leone returned with For a Few Dollars More, and this time he made everything bigger, bolder, and even better. Clint Eastwood reprised his role as the man with no name, but now he wasn't alone. Joining him was Lee Van Cleef, playing a rival bounty hunter named Colonel Mortimer. The setup was simple. Two men, both after the same outlaw. At first, they're competitors, sizing each other up with suspicion, but eventually they join forces to take down a ruthless bandit named El Indio, played with chilling intensity by Jean-Marie Volonté. The pairing of Eastwood and Van Cleef was electric. Eastwood had the cool, detached edge, while Van Cleef brought authority, experience, and a simmering sense of vengeance. Their partnership gave the film an extra layer of tension and depth. Once again, Leone filled the movie with his signature style. Long silences, sudden bursts of gunfire, and close-ups so tight you could see every bead of sweat. And again, Morricone's score was unforgettable, with the haunting chimes of a musical pocket watch that became central to the story. For a Few Dollars More proved that the spaghetti western wasn't a fluke. It was a movement. And audiences were hooked. These films were dirtier, bloodier, and more morally complex than the Hollywood westerns they were used to. And they were only building towards something even greater. By the mid-1960s, the spaghetti western had become a global phenomenon. Clint Eastwood was no longer just a TV actor. He was becoming the face of a new kind of cowboy. Sergio Leone was rewriting the rules of cinema itself. And Ennio Morricone's music was seeping into the cultural bloodstream, giving the Western a new sound that would echo for decades. But Leone wasn't finished. His next film would take everything he had built, the style, the music, the tension, and raise it to a level no one thought possible. A film that would become not just one of the greatest Westerns, but one of the greatest movies of all time. From the moment its opening credits appeared on screen, the good, the bad, and the ugly told audiences they were in for something different. Clint Eastwood returned once again as the man with no name, known here as Blondie, the good. Lee Van Cleef, who had been Eastwood's uneasy ally in For a Few Dollars More, returned as Angel Eyes, the bad, a ruthless killer who always finishes what he starts. And then there was Eli Wallach as Tuco, the ugly, a greedy, scheming bandit with just enough charm to make him unforgettable. The story was set against the backdrop of the American Civil War, giving the film a scale and weight beyond the usual outlaw tale. The three men, each driven by greed, hunt for a buried fortune of Confederate gold. Their paths twist and turn, alliances form and break, and betrayal hangs in the air like smoke. Leone turned tension into an art form. Long, drawn-out standoffs where the camera darted between eyes, hands, guns, and faces. Silences that seemed to stretch forever, broken by sudden, shocking bursts of violence. Leone treated the Western like an opera, with each duel and betrayal playing like music. And speaking of music, Ennio Morricone's score wasn't just iconic, it was legendary. That eerie, wailing main theme, built on the sound of human voices imitating coyotes, became instantly recognizable. Even today, just a few notes are enough to conjure images of dusty plains, dueling gunmen, and the harsh beauty of the frontier. The climax of the film, The three-way standoff in a circular cemetery is one of the most famous scenes in movie history. The build-up is nearly wordless. The music swells, cutting between the three men's faces, their hands twitching toward their guns, the world holding its breath. And when the guns finally go off, it feels like the entire film has been leading to that one perfect moment. Beneath all the style, Leone was saying something deeper. This wasn't the West of noble sheriffs and heroic lawmen. This was a world where greed, betrayal, and violence ruled, where men killed not for justice, but for gold. And yet somehow, within that chaos, there was still a strange kind of honor, especially in Eastwood's Blondie, the good, who may not have been pure, but still carried a sense of balance and fairness. When The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was released, critics in America weren't sure what to make of it. Some dismissed it as violent and overindulgent. But audiences loved it. Over time, its reputation grew, until it became not only the most famous spaghetti western, but one of the greatest films ever made. Today, it's impossible to talk about westerns without mentioning it. It influenced generations of filmmakers, from Quentin Tarantino to Martin Scorsese. Its style, those long standoffs, the music, the gritty morality, became part of the language of cinema. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that the Western could be more than just America's genre. It could belong to the world. By the end of 1966, the Western was no longer just about the American frontier. It was about myth, style, and the eternal clash of men driven by greed, vengeance, and survival. Leone had raised the stakes so high that no one could ever look at the genre the same way again. And yet, he wasn't done. His next film wouldn't just raise the bar, it would create one of the greatest masterpieces in the history of cinema. A film that took the myth of the West and turned it into pure art. If The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was a violent opera, Once Upon a Time in the West was a full-blown symphony. It was slower, grander, and even more ambitious. Leone wasn't just making another Western, he was crafting a cinematic elegy, the death of the Old West, captured on film. The movie begins with one of the most famous openings in cinema history. Three hired gunmen wait at a lonely train station. They say nothing. They fidget, swat at flies, drink water. Minutes go by with no dialogue. All we hear is the sound of the wind, the creak of wood, a squeaking windmill. The tension builds and builds until finally the train arrives, and a single harmonica note cuts through the silence. That harmonica belonged to Charles Bronson, who played a mysterious drifter known only as Harmonica. He has one purpose: vengeance. His target? Frank, a ruthless killer played by Henry Fonda. And this is where Leone pulled his boldest move. Up until then, Henry Fonda had been Hollywood's great everyman, a face audiences trusted. He had played Abraham Lincoln, noble fathers, men of justice and morality. But here, Leone cast him as pure evil. When Fonda steps onto the screen with those icy blue eyes and guns down an innocent family, including a child, the audience knew instantly that this was not the Henry Fonda they had known. Alongside them was Claudia Cardinale as Jill, a former prostitute who becomes the heart of the story. She's tough, resilient, and intelligent, a woman trying to build a new life in the brutal landscape of the West. And Jason Robards played Cheyenne, an outlaw with charm and rough humor who provides both grit and humanity. The story itself is simple on the surface. A widow, a drifter, a bandit, and a killer all collide around a piece of land that will become vital for the railroad. But beneath that story is something bigger. Leone was showing the end of an era. The railroad symbolized progress, the closing of the frontier, the death of the lawless West. Harmonica and Frank represented the old order, men of violence, vengeance, and blood. Jill represented the future, the people who would build towns, families, and a new society. Every frame of the film is meticulously crafted. Leone stretched moments to their breaking point, letting tension build until you could barely breathe. Then, when violence finally came, it was quick, brutal, and shocking. And once again, Ennio Morricone's score became legendary. Each character had their own theme. Harmonica's eerie notes echoed his haunting past. Frank's theme was dark and menacing. Jill's theme, soaring and emotional, gave the film its heart. Morricone even wrote the music before filming began, allowing Leone to shoot scenes around the rhythm and flow of the score. The result was a movie that felt less like a Western and more like a cinematic opera, where music and images danced together in perfect harmony. At the time of its release, Once Upon a Time in the West wasn't an immediate hit in America. Some critics thought it was too slow, too indulgent. But in Europe, it was celebrated as a masterpiece, and over the years, its reputation has only grown. Today, it's widely regarded as one of the greatest Westerns ever made, and for many, one of the greatest films in all of cinema. Its influence can be seen everywhere, from the slow-burn tension of Quentin Tarantino's movies to the visual storytelling of modern filmmakers like Denis Villeneuve. Leone's fingerprints are all over the language of film, but perhaps its greatest legacy is the way it closed a chapter. Once Upon a Time in the West gave us the Western as myth, as legend, as poetry in motion. It felt like the final sunset on the cowboy era, the moment when the gunslinger rode off not into the distance, but into history. With it, Leone created not just a Western, but a requiem for the entire genre. By 1969, the Western had been pulled in every direction: mythic, gritty, philosophical, epic. Yet there were still surprises left. Two films that year captured the genre's final transformations, one modern, witty, and bittersweet, and the other rugged, violent, and brutally honest. First came Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a film that turned the outlaw tale into something funny, tragic, and deeply human. Directed by George Roy Hill, it followed the real-life outlaws Butch Cassidy and his partner, the Sundance Kid. Paul Newman played Butch, Robert Redford played Sundance, and together they were unstoppable. Newman brought his trademark charm and easy humor, while Redford gave the film sharpness and quiet intensity. Their chemistry was pure lightning in a bottle. The movie had everything: train robberies, shootouts, romance, and one of the best partnerships ever put on film. But what really made it shine was the friendship at its core. These weren't just outlaws on the run, they were friends facing the end of an era. They laughed in the face of danger because deep down they knew time was catching up to them. There's that unforgettable moment when they leap off a cliff into a raging river to escape a posse. "I can't swim," Butch shouts. "Are you crazy?" Sundance yells back. "The fall will probably kill ya." That mix of fear, humor, and bravado summed up everything about them. They were outlaws with charm, men who refused to quit even as the world moved past them. And then came the quieter moments, like the famous bicycle scene set to "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head." It was playful, almost whimsical, a piece of pure joy in the middle of a doomed story. The song became a hit, and though it felt out of place to some critics, it captured the film's heart perfectly. The ending, though, was pure tragedy. Cornered in Bolivia, Butch and Sundance make a desperate last stand. The film freezes as they charge out, guns blazing, surrounded by soldiers. We never see them fall, but we don't have to. That single freeze frame became one of the most iconic moments in movie history. A moment that said everything about courage, loyalty, and the inevitability of change. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid became a massive success. It won 4 Oscars, including Best Original Screenplay and Best Song. Audiences adored it, and Newman and Redford's friendship became legend. For many, it was the Western's swan song, a farewell to the old frontier, delivered with laughter, style, and heartbreak. If Butch Cassidy gave us the West's playful modern side, True Grit brought us back to its rugged roots. Released later that same year, it starred the man who had been the face of the Western for decades, John Wayne. By 1969, Wayne was in his 60s. He had already played dozens of cowboys, lawmen, and soldiers, but in True Grit, He gave one of his most memorable performances. He played Rooster Cogburn, a one-eyed, whiskey-drinking U.S. Marshal with a gruff exterior and a surprisingly soft heart. When a determined young girl named Maddie Ross hires him to track down her father's killer, Rooster reluctantly takes the job, along with a Texas Ranger named LaBeouf, played by Glenn Campbell. The performance earned him his first and only Academy Award for Best Actor. For fans, it was a fitting tribute to the man who had defined the Western hero for a generation. True Grit was a bridge between eras. One foot in the old Hollywood Western, one in the rougher, more cynical world to come. It reminded audiences that even in a changing world, there was still room for courage and heart. But while John Wayne gave us the last great traditional cowboy story, another filmmaker was preparing to tear down the myth of the West entirely. His name was Sam Peckinpah, and his film would change everything. When The Wild Bunch hit theaters in 1969, it was like an explosion. From the very first scene, Peckinpah made it clear that this was not your father's Western. The film opened with a group of outlaws disguised as soldiers riding into a Texas town. As they attempt a robbery, chaos erupts. Bullets fly, people scream, and the screen fills with blood. Peckinpah filmed the gunfight in slow motion, every burst of violence stretched into poetry. For audiences used to clean, bloodless shootouts, it was shocking, unlike anything they'd ever seen. The story followed Pike Bishop, played by William Holden, and his gang of aging outlaws trying to pull off one last big score. They're pursued by a former ally turned bounty hunter, played by Robert Ryan. Along the way, they clash with Mexican revolutionaries and confront their own fading place in the world. These were not noble heroes. They were tired, bitter men chasing one final payday in a world that no longer had room for them. Peckinpah's vision of the West was brutal and uncompromising. The days of the frontier were gone, replaced by modernity, corruption, and death. The men of the Wild Bunch were relics who chose to go out in a blaze of glory rather than fade away. In the film's unforgettable final sequence, Pike and his men walk calmly toward a Mexican army compound, knowing full well they won't survive. What follows is one of the most violent, chaotic shootouts in movie history, a bloody ballet of slow motion, smoke, and sacrifice. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece. Others called it obscene. But everyone agreed it was unforgettable. Over time, The Wild Bunch has come to be seen as a landmark in film history, the moment when the Western finally grew up, confronting the violence that had always been at its heart. By the end of the 1960s, the Western had completed its transformation. It was no longer a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It had become a mirror for America itself, its myths, its morals, its violence, and its loss of innocence. With The Magnificent Seven, we saw outlaws finding redemption. With The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, we saw how legends are born and truth is forgotten. How the West Was Won gave us the last of the grand heroic myths. Sergio Leone gave us art and grit with the Dollars trilogy and Once Upon a Time in the West. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid gave us humor and tragedy. True Grit gave us heart, and The Wild Bunch gave us blood and truth. The 1960s were the decade when the Western grew up. This is Yesterday's. Thanks for watching.